Title of the text is The Study of Poetry. This is being written by Matthew Arnold, and Matthew Arnold ने इसको लिखा था. It was written as an introduction to the Thomas Humphrey Ward. Thomas Humphrey Ward's The Study of Poetry. I mean, this Thomas Humphrey Ward, he edited some volumes, and one of the volume is volume number 4, The English Poets, in which he asked Arnold to write down introduction. So Arnold ने introduction लिखा है, और उससे पहले मैं थोड़ा सा आपको ये थोड़ा introduction में दे देती हूँ कि ये कैसे शुरुआत हुई है और कैसे इसको लिखा. तो आर्नल्ड कहते हैं, बिफोर ही थॉट ऑफ राइटिंग द इंट्रोडक्शन, उससे पहले थोड़ा सा डिस्कशन में आपको बताती हूँ. एवरीथिंग इज नाउ डार्क एंड melancholy इन मिस्टर ग्रे's room. Not a trace of him remained there. It looks as if it has been for some time uninhabited, and the room bespoke of another. हाँ, अब मैं आपको इंट्रोडक्शन अबाउट who is Thomas Humphrey Ward. Thomas Humphrey Ward, the husband of Arnold's niece Mary, approached Arnold with proposals of his anthology of English poets in late October 1878. Arnold expressed warm approval but declined to participate. Plans in which I could join if I were a man of letters purely and simply. I cannot join in now that I am a school inspector with a very limited time at my disposal for letters. I am obliged to keep for work which has suggested itself to my own mind, that little time which I have free, and therefore he had declined John Morley's proposal to do a monograph on Shakespeare for the Englishman. So that's why initially he declined, and finally he simply wrote the introduction as the title, The Study of Poetry. Now let's discuss further what is there in the study of poetry. This is a text which is in your syllabus, MA, post-graduation, Delhi University course. So उसमें what is there in the study of poetry which is being written by Matthew Arnold. Now let me come, because primarily we will be going by the text. अभी हम सिर्फ ये जो टेक्स्ट है उसको पढ़ेंगे, उसके बारे में हम समझने की कोशिश करेंगे. What is there? So while you think of what is there in the study of poetry, by listening this video, by watching this video, you can actually understand what is there. So initially he says that he is talking about the poetry, and then he says that even if in the religion there is a poetry, even in our unconscious there is a poetry. So poetry is an idea, and poetry is related with the truth. And then he says that it has attached its emotion to the fact, and now the fact is falling. But for poetry, the idea is everything. The rest is the world of illusion, of divine illusion. Poetry attaches its emotion to the idea. The idea is the fact. So he's saying that poetry has primarily the idea and emotion. These are the two things, idea and emotion, which is very significant in poetry. And then he says that poetry is a stream in which all other streams, different streams of different regions, poetries are mixing here. It is combining. So many streams are coming in this. So he says that primarily we are talking about English poetry. Okay, we are not talking about all other kinds of poetry. We are talking about English poetry. And then he says that there are several streams of poetry add to the mighty river of poetry. And then he says poetry interprets life. Okay, if you want to understand life, if you want to understand the philosophy of life, then poetry can tell you what is their life. And then he says that in science, religion, philosophy, all those things can be combined in the poetry. He gives the example or the quote from Wordsworth. He says, the impatient expression which is in the countenance of all signs. What Wordsworth says about poetry, poetry is the impatient expressions which is in the countenance of all signs. So in a way, if we want to understand the philosophy, the religion and idea of life, and if we want to understand science even, then we can actually look into poetry. And then another quotation he gives from Wordsworth is that poetry is breathe and finer spirit of all knowledge. This is the quotation given by Wordsworth for poetry. And Arnold is quoting Wordsworth here. He says, poetry is the breathe and finer spirit of all knowledge. So in the poetry, we set very high standard and a strict judgment. So these are the things which he is talking. I mean, primarily, first of all, I am just giving you the significant ideas about poetry. Significant ideas about poetry and what is there in Arnold's, what are the more main points. Then we will go by the text. So I'm just giving you main points of that. And when he talks about Chaucer, he says that Chaucer is mostly, the subject matter of Chaucer's poetry is human being. The way when we talk about Wordsworth, the subject matter of Wordsworth poetry is nature. So in a way, Chaucer talks about human beings, the nature of human people. And there are certain things which are related with the poetry, that good poetry, that is, it has regularity, it has uniformity, it must be precise, and it must have complete balance. These are the things which is, these are the points which is talking when he's discussing about poetry. And then he talks about that there are a number of other significant points we will discuss further. So, all the other streams, all the other rivers are including in this mighty river of poetry. And that is why primarily we are talking about English poetry. And for every interpretation of life, if you want to understand the philosophy of life, for every interpretation of life, we can take support and the knowledge from poetry. So if we want to understand life, if we want to to understand life, so then he says, more and more mankind will discover that we have to turn to poetry to interpret life for us, to console us, to sustain us. Without poetry, our science will appear incomplete. This is the quote I'm reading from the text. And further he says that, if we want to understand science even, and if we compare science with poetry, then poetry is much better than science. So he says that, I will say will appear incomplete without science. I will say will appear incomplete without it. For finally and truly, does Wordsworth call the impatient expression which is in countenance of all signs. So the poetry has this much of quality that we can actually take it as the complete science. And then he talks about the charlatanism. And he says, in poetry, which is thought and art in one, it is glory, the eternal honor, that charlatanism shall find no interest, that this noble spare be kept involved and inviolable. Charlatanism for confusing or obliterating the distinction between excellent and inferior, sound and unsound, or only half sound, true and untrue, or only half true. It is charlatanism, conscious or unconscious. Whenever we confuse or obliterate these, and in poetry more than anywhere else, it is unpermissible to confess or obliterate them. For in poetry, the distinction between excellent and inferior, sound and unsound, or only half sound, true and untrue, or only half true, is of paramount importance. It is of paramount importance because of the high destinies of poetry. In poetry, as a criticism of life under condition fixed for such a criticism, the truth, the poetic beauty, the spirit of our race will find. We have said, as time goes on, and as other have failed consolation and stay, but the consolation and stay will be for power and in proportion to the power of the criticism of life, and the criticism of life will be of power of proportion, as the poetry conveying it is excellent rather than inferior, sound rather than unsound or half sound, and true rather than untrue or half true. So this is what the quality of poetry we can understand. And then he says that what is the best poetry? Okay, if you want to understand what is the best poetry, then this definition we can get from Arnold's introduction. The best poetry is what we want. The best poetry will be found to have a power of forming, sustaining, and delighting us, and nothing else can. A clearer, deeper sense of the best in poetry and of the strength and joy to be drawn from it. It is most precious benefit which we can gather from poetical collections such as the present. So, if we want to understand, what is there in the best poetry? The best poetry has a form, a sustainability, and delighting us. So, it has there are certain qualities which a best poetry is having. And what are these qualities? Regularity, uniformity, precision, and balance. Apart from this, the best poetry has formation. It has a forming, sustaining, and delighting quality as well. This is actually a very significant paragraph, which I think need to be read, which is significant here. Here he talks about the historical. There are two kinds of estimates he's talking about poetry: historical estimate and personal estimate. Like the poetry, through poetry we can understand history as well, and through poetry we can understand the personal feelings also. So poetry is somewhere giving these two kind of distinct characteristics. And what is that? The historic estimate and the personal estimate, both of which are fallacious. A poet or a poem may count to us historically. They may count to us on ground personal to ourselves, and they may count us really. They may count to us historically. The course of development of a nation's language, thought, and poetry. So poetry can give us a historical estimate, as well as it can give us the personal estimate. When we talk about poetry, poetry gives language, thought, and diction to the nation. So that these are the qualities of poetry, he is saying. In the next para, he says actually he's using a word fallacy. And in what sense he is talking this fallacy, let us discuss. He says how a poetry or poems can have fallacy, or maybe the exaggeration of emotions. So then he's giving suggestions. Then we have to, as a good poet, we have to be careful when we are talking about the or expressing our emotions. So the fallacy or this false impression should not overread the actual emotion. He says both fallacies are natural. It is evident how naturally the study of history and development of poetry may incline a man to pose over reputation and work once conspicuous, but now obscure, and to quarrel with a careless public for skipping, in obedience to mere tradition and habit, from one famous name or work in its national poetry to another, ignorant of what it is misses, and of the reason for keeping what it keeps. So fallacy is a exaggeration of emotions which need to be controlled in the poetry. He says So rises in our poetic judgment the fallacy caused by estimate will be may call historic. Then again, a poet or a poem may count to us on ground personal to ourselves. Our personal affinities, likings, and criticism have greater power to sway our estimate of this or that poet work and to make us attach more importance to the poetry than in itself is really possessed. So there are three things he's saying. What is that? The personal affinities, likings, and circumstances. These three things: personal affinities, likings, and circumstances of our personal emotions. It could lead to the actual emotion. So that's how we have to be very careful. And then he talks about French poetry. Okay, he says that there is the French have become a diligent student of their own early poetry, which they long neglected. The study makes many of them dissatisfied with their so-called classical poetry, the court tragedy of the 17th century, which nevertheless has signed in France as absolutely as if it had been the perfection of classical poetry indeed. He's saying that the French people, they have started poetry so early, and they have been the very diligent student of poetry. So they have actually, with the time and consistency, they developed their poetry. And what is this? Who are the classical poets and what is the real poetry? These are the things he's trying to say. So, let's understand who are the classical poets, what do they do, and what is there the reality of these classical poets. He says, if all this is brilliantly and telling said, we must plead for distinction. Everything depends on the reality of poet's classic character. If he is dubious classic, let us shift him. If he is a false classic, let us explode him. But if he is a real classic, if his work belong to the class of the very best, for this is the true and right meaning of the word classical, then the great thing for us is to feel and enjoy his work so deeply as ever as we can, and or to appreciate the wide difference between it and all other works. So he says that who is the real classic, who is the real classical poet, and that distinction is very significant for us to know. And then he says that everything depends on the reality of a poet's classical character. If he is a dubious classic, let us shift him. If he is a false classic, let us explode him. But if he is a real classic, if his work belongs to the class of a very best, for this is true and right meaning of the word classic and classical, then the great thing for us to feel and enjoy his work so deeply. That's what he says. And then he says, who are genuine classic? Because the different categories of classic he has given, and then he says, who is genuine classic? He says, to trace the labor, the attempt and weakness, the failure of a genuine classic, to acquaint oneself worth his time and his life and his historical relationship, is mere literary dilettantism unless it has the clear sense and deeper enjoyment of its own. It may be said that the more we know about a classic, the better we shall enjoy him. So then he says genuine classic. Okay, acquaint with his mere time and his life, his historical relationship with the literary criticism, literary growth. And then he says, he talks about true classic, false classic, genuine classic, and dubious classic. True, if times were not so short and schoolboys which not so soon tired and their power of attention exhausted, only as it is, the elaborate philosophical preparations goes on, but the author are little known and less enjoyed. So, with the investigators of the historic origins in the poetry, he thought to enjoy the true classic, all the better for his investigations. He often is distracted from the enjoyment of the best with the with the less good, he overbusies himself and is prone to overrate it in proportion to the trouble which it has cost him. This is what he says: the historic origin of the poetry and the true nature, the true classical poetry. Then he says, I say to set it fixedly before our mind as our objects in studying poetry and poets and poetry, and to make the desire of attaining it the one principle to which, as the limitation says, whatever we may read or come to know, we always written. The historic estimate is likely in special to offer our judgment and our language when we are dealing with ancient poets. The personal estimate when we are dealing with poets, our contemporaries, at any rate modern. The exaggerations due to the historic estimate are not in themselves perhaps of very much gravity. And then he talks about Emvitate. Okay, Emvitate, Cadmon, these are the classic poets. And then he's comparing Cadmon with the Milton also. And then he's here Cadmon amongst our own poets, comparing to publish a French critic of the historic origin. Another eminent French critic, Emvitate, comments upon the famous document of the early poetry of his nation. And then William the Conqueror. Okay, Taillefer, who was with the William the Conqueror's army at Hastings, marched before the Norman troops, so that the traditions singing of the songs who died at in the battlefield. This tradition is preserved in the poems. The poem preserved in a manuscript of the 12th century in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. So he's talking about certain poems which are being preserved, and then he's talking about Cadmon, Emvitate, and the Taillefer, who was also accompanying William the Conqueror. Then the next paragraph he talks about that which are the poems which are good, which are the poems the poets which belong to truly classical flavor. He says, we are here in another world, another order of poetry altogether. Here is rightly due such supreme praise as that which Emvitate gives to the Chanson de Roland. If our words are to have any meaning, if our judgment are to have any solidity, we must not heap that supreme praise upon poetry of an order immeasurably inferior. And what are the best poems? What are the best classical and truly classical poems? He says, an infallible touchstone for detecting the presence and absence of high poetic quality, and also the degree of this quality. Here it is very significant for us to mention the touchstone theory. Touchstone theory is actually invented by Arnold himself. And the simplest way I can explain is there are two works which are being compared. Okay, one is best and the another is not some significant. So when you compare two works together, this is known as touchstone. There are other references are also available with this. Then he says about what the poetry has. There are some certain significant qualities which a poem is having, or which a poetry is having. And these qualities are style, manner, diction, and superior substance, truth, seriousness. Okay, so the best poetry is a superior poetry, or is a serious poetry, and rest of the other qualities are the best poetry is having proper style, its manner, the diction is very clear, the thoughts and ideas are very supreme and serious. So, and the superior substance is there. These are the qualities he is attaching with the poetry. He says, there is a one word he is using, fallacious. this fallacious word he is using with the poetry. Fallacious is the literal meaning of the fallacy is fallacious is wrong, I mean untruth. And then he says these few lines, if we have, I mean okay, poetry can save us from the false judgment also. And here he says, because he says taken actually 2 lines of the poem, and he's quoting that. And after that he gives the explanation, that is, these few lines, if we have tact and can use them, are enough even of themselves to keep clean and sound our judgment about poetry, to save us from fallacious estimate of it, to conduct us to the real estimate. So it gives you the proper judgment also. And that's how he says high quality poetry. The character of a high quality of poetry are what is expressed there. They are far better recognized by being felt in the verse of the master than by being persuaded in the prose of the critic. Nevertheless, if we are urgently pressed to give some critical account of them, we may safely perhaps venture on laying down, not indeed how and why the character arise, but where in what they arise. They are in the matters and substance of the poetry. They are in the manner and style. Both of these, the substance and matter on the one hand, and the style and manner on the other hand, have a mark, an accent, and high beauty, a word and power. But if we ask to define this mark and accent in the abstract, our answer must be no, for we should thereby be darkening the question, not clearing it. The mark and accent are as given by the substance and matter of the poetry, by the style and manner of that poetry, and of all poetry which is akin to its quality. So here in this paragraph he says about the high quality matter substance of the poetry. And then he says, what is the best poetry? Whom would you define as a superior poetry? He says, only one thing we may add as to the substance and matter of the poetry, guiding ourselves by Aristotle's profound observation that the superiority of poetry over history consists in its possession a high truth and a high seriousness. So there is a comparison between the history and the poetry, and he says that compared to history, writing of history, poetry is superior. The superior character of truth and seriousness in the matter and substance of the best poetry is inseparable. So superiority and seriousness are inseparable character of the best poetry. Then further, this is a very good example he's saying. He talks about Barnetto Latini. Barnetto Latini in 1220 to 1294. He was a guardian of Dante. Dante, we all know, Divine Comedy. Dante's Divine Comedy is very popular, and Barnetto Latini was his guardian. After the death of Dante's father, Barnetto Latini took him under his guardianship. And he talks about the philosopher. Barnetto Latini was a philosopher, scholar, notarian, politician, and a statesman. He was from Italy. So, and what Giovanni Villani says about Barnetto Latini. He was a great philosopher and a consummate master of the rhetoric, not only in knowing how to speak well, but how to write well. So this is a very beautiful quote from Giovanni Villani about Barnetto Latini. And what he says about Barnetto Latini, who was Barnetto Latini? Just find out his qualities. He was a great philosopher and consummate master of the rhetoric, not only knowing how to speak well, but how to write well. These are the qualities about Barnetto Latini. Then in the further paragraph, he talks about French poetry, because he's actually keep on talking about French poetry, and he says that how French, there is an origin of the poetry in the France, and how they have maintained high standard in the poetry. So once more I return to the early poetry of France, with which our own poetry in its origin is indissoluble. connected. In the 12th and 13th century, that seed time of all modern language and literature, the poetry of France had a clear predominance in Europe. Of the two divisions of that poetry, it production in the language langue d'oil and the production in the langue d'oil. The poetry of the langue d'oil or southern France of the troubadours is of the importance because of its effect on Italian literature. The first literature of modern Europe so strike the true and grand note and to bring forth as the Dante and Petrarch to brought further. So Dante and Petrarch, we all know they are the most famous classics and they have contributed a lot in the poetry. So he is comparing somewhere the French poetry with the British poetry. And then he says, in the 12th century, the bloom of this Romance poetry was earlier and stronger in England at the court of our Anglo-Norman king than in France itself. But it was a bloom of France poetry as our native poetry formed itself. It formed itself out of this, the Romance poems which took possession of the heart and imagination of Europe in the 12th and 13th century are French. They are, as Saudi justly says, the pride of French literature. So here you will find, in the 12th century, how this French poetry is emerging. It is developing and it is actually achieving the heights also. Then we says the Italian Barnetto Latini. I have already given you the detail about Italian Barnetto Latini. And he was a very much prominently exhibited. He is very much prominently reflected in the writings of Dante's Divine Comedy. And it is people say Barnetto, Dante के जो गुरु थे, उनको Barnetto Latini ही थे. He talks about the French Romance poetry, of which the weight and substance and the power of style are not unfairly represented by this extract from the Christian of Troyes. Only by the means of the historic estimate can we pursue ourselves how to think that any of it is of poetical importance. So then in the poetry, the word is significant, rhyme, meter and form. So these are the things he says. What is there significant in the poetry? Word, rhyme, meter and form. And then he talks about Chaucer. Actually, there are some significant qualities he talks about Chaucer that we will discuss later on. Let us understand Chaucer from Arnold's perspective. We are not going into this debate because you will find number of other references and all. Because when he's comparing, because primarily, the first impression, mostly people talk about that Arnold is not keeping Chaucer on a very high spirit. And Arnold is a big critique of Chaucer also. So, to keeping this idea aside right now, later on I'll come to the point. First, let me say what Arnold is talking about Chaucer. And this is what I'm reading from his text himself, from this text. So, what is that? If we ask ourselves wherein consists the immense superiority of Chaucer's poetry over the Romance poetry, why it is that in passion from this Chaucer we suddenly feel ourselves to be in another world. We shall find that his superiority is both in substance of his poetry and in style of his poetry. His superiority in the substance is given by it's his large, free, simple, clear, yet kindly a view of human life. See, this point is very significant. And what he says, what is the subject matter of Chaucer's poetry? The subject matter of Chaucer's poetry is, okay, so he is very particular about Chaucer. And let me say what he's saying about Chaucer. He says, if we ask ourselves wherein consists the immense superiority of Chaucer's poetry over the Romance poetry. Why it is that? Because he is comparing Chaucer's poetry with the Romantic poetry. Why it is that in Passion from this to Chaucer, we suddenly feel ourselves to be in another world. We shall find that his superiority is both in substance of his poetry and the style of his poetry. There are two things he is talking about Chaucer's poetry: substance of his poetry and style of his poetry. And his superiority in substance is given by his large, free, simple, clear, yet kindly view of human life. I repeat this statement. What Chaucer talks about, the subject matter of his poetry is the style of his poetry. The subject matter of Chaucer's poetry is his large, free, simple, clear, yet kindly view of human life. So, the main substance of Chaucer's poetry is human life. How he sees human life as a large, free, simple, and clear a human life. So, unlike the total want in the Romantic poets of all intelligent command of it, Chaucer has not that helplessness. He has gained the power to survey the world from the central. A truly human point of view, we have only to call to mind the prologue to the Canterbury Tales, the right common comment upon it is Dryden. It is sufficient to say, according to the proverb, that here is God's plenty, and again, here is perpetual fountain of good sense. It is by a large, free sound representation of things that poetry, this high criticism of life, has truth of substance, and Chaucer's poetry has truth of substance. So now try to understand what he's saying. He's saying that Chaucer's poetry has human substance, human life, which is at a large level, free level, and a simple, clear, yet very kind. And he says, here is the perpetual fountain of good sense. So, Romantic poets are being compared with the substance of the Chaucer's subject matter. And the subject matter of Chaucer is human being. So, which has abundance of information, abundance of knowledge. Of his style and manner, if we think first of the Romance poetry and then of the Chaucer's divine liquidness of diction, his divinity, his divine fluidity of movement, and it is difficult to speak temperately, they are irresistible and justify all the rapture with which the successors speak of his gold dewdrops of speech. Okay, I repeat this again. Let's say what Chaucer is talking. Okay, what the style and manner of the Chaucer. Of his style and manner, if we think first of the Romance poetry, then of the Chaucer's divine liquidness of the diction. Chaucer's divine liquidness of the diction, his divine liquidity of the movement. It is difficult to speak temperately. They are irresistible and justifying all the raptures with his successor speaks of his gold dewdrops of speech. So, Chaucer is he himself is saying, Chaucer is the father of our splendid English poetry. A nation may have versified with smooth numbers and easy rhyme, and yet may have not real poetry of all. Chaucer is the father of our splendid English poetry. He is our well of English undefined by the lovely charm of his diction, the lovely charm of his movement, and he make in epoch and found at tradition. Chaucer is, the simple understanding and the knowledge of human life, which is being given by Chaucer in his poetry. And then he says, Chaucer has a liquidity of diction. Okay, so Chaucer's diction is, a lot of variables are there, and it talks about the human virtue and virtues of manners, and that's how the Chaucer writes his poetry. The charm of Chaucer's verse, they merely one line like this: O martyr sounds to virginity, has a virtue of manner, a movement such as we shall not find in all these works of romantic poetry. So primarily, we have to understand two things. One is Chaucer, the comparison of Chaucer with the romantic poet. So that's an entirely different thing. But what is the subject matter of Chaucer? What is the subject matter of Chaucer's poetry? That is also significant here. Then but later on he criticized Chaucer. Okay, so he sees not having very high opinion about Chaucer. That was the subject matter in the style of Chaucer we have discussed. Now what he says further about Chaucer, because there he's criticizing Chaucer. He's saying, putting a lot of limitations on Chaucer. And then this is a very significant paragraph. By listening this paragraph, you will actually come out of the all the conflict you must be having in your mind. The idea, maybe the idea is not clear, and you are confused that what Arnold is saying about Chaucer. So by listening this paragraph, things would be very easy for you to understand. The charm is departed. It is often said that the power of liquidness and fluidity in Chaucer verse was dependent upon a free and licentious dealing with language, such as is now impossible upon a liberty, such as Burns to enjoy, of making words like neck, bird into a dissyllable by adding to them, and words like cause rhyme into a dissyllable by sounding the e mute. It is true that Chaucer's fluidity. So when he is criticizing Chaucer, what does he say? It is true that Chaucer's fluidity is conjoined with his disliberty and is admirably served by it. But we ought now not to say that it was dependent upon it. It was dependent upon his talent. Other poets with a like liberty do not attain to the fluidity of Chaucer, but Burns himself does not sustain it to it. Poets again who have a talent akin to Chaucer, such as Shakespeare and Keats, have known how to attain its fluidity without the like liberty. Yet Chaucer is not one of the great classics. Now remember this. This is maybe one of the line which might have made this impression that what he thinks about Chaucer. So this is a line from his own text, The Study of Poetry, and he says, Arnold says about Chaucer, and yet Chaucer is not one of the great classics. His poetry transcends and effaces easily without efforts all the Romance poetry of Catholic Christendom. It transcends and effaces all the English poetry contemporary with it. It transcends and affects all the English poetry subsequent to it down to the age of Elizabeth. For such avail is poetic truth of substance to its natural and necessary union with poetic truth of style. And yet I say Chaucer is not one of the great classics. So this paragraph actually determines the belief and the understanding which is, concluded that what Arnold is saying about Chaucer. He says Chaucer is not one of the great classics. Initially he says Chaucer is not one of the great classics. The same statement is repeated by twice in this paragraph. He has no that accent. What is wanting to him is suggested by the mere mention of the name of the first great classic of Christendom, the immortal poet who died 80 years before Chaucer, Dante, the accent of such verses. So that's how he doesn't take Chaucer so high. And when he's comparing Chaucer with other classic writers, he doesn't give him so much value. And then, this criticism further goes on. And because he's comparing Chaucer with Aristotle, then Chaucer with Dante, and there are a number of other scholars, Shakespeare, Milton, Homer. He's comparing Chaucer with everyone else. And then he says, therefore, of Chaucer as a poet, there must be this limitation. He lacked the high seriousness of the great classic. So these are the 3-4 statements. Let me again give you that he's when he's comparing Chaucer with other poets, then he says that Chaucer as a poet, there must be limitations, and he lacks the high seriousness of the great classic poets. So that's how his ideas about Chaucer is there. But initially, he talks about the subject matter of Chaucer, what Chaucer is writing, what is his subject matter, style, manner, and everything he's talking about that. So his style of his poetry, superiority, and his substance, he's talking about the human life. So these are the things he gives earlier. Now we come to the there are some writers he's talking about, the poets he's talking about, that is Dryden. He's talking about Dryden, Addison, Pope, and Johnson. Okay. These are the poets he's talking, and he says yes. So actually this whole paragraph is dedicated to the Dryden, Addison, Pope, and Johnson, and I'm just giving you a very little idea about this. Some few lines I'm just reading out. That is, and all through the 18th century and down even into our own times, the stereotyped phrase of approbation for good verse found in our early poetry has been that it's been approached the verse of Dryden, Addison, Pope, and Johnson. So, but Wordsworth and Coleridge, further then he's talking about Dryden and Pope, they are the poetical classics, is the historic estimate, and which represent them such as what has been so long established that it can't be easily given up. And Wordsworth and Coleridge, as is well known, denied, but the authority of the Wordsworth and Coleridge does not weight much with the young generation. So, Wordsworth and Coleridge, they are classics, and they have a heavy weight in the poetry field. So there are two poets he's talking about right now, the Milton and Dryden. And let me just, after reading this, it would be more easy and clear for you, because the language which has been used here is so simple. We can understand easily. When we find Milton writing, and long it was not after, when I was confirmed in this opinion, that he who would not be frustrated of his hope to write well, therefore in laudable things, ought himself to be a true poem. And then he talks about Dryden telling us what Virgil wrote in the vigor of his age, in plenty and at ease, I have undertaken to translate in my declining years, struggling with the wants, oppressed with sickness, curbed in my genuine genius, liable to the misconstruct in all I write. Then we exclaim that here at last we have the true English prose, a prose such as we would all gladly use of it, we only know how. Yet Dryden was Milton's contemporary. So through these all we come to know, he's comparing Dryden with Milton, and then he's giving the estimation of Chaucer and rest of the other classic poets. We are here to regard Dryden as the glorious founder, Pope as the splendid high priest, and our age of the prose and reason. So he's giving high opinion. He's keeping very high opinion about Dryden and Pope. And then this one paragraph which is being dedicated for the Gray. Okay, so what is the style of Gray and how he's writing? There is a lot discussion about Gray. So I'll just give you a little idea what he's talking about Gray. Gray is our poetical classic of that literature and age. The position of Gray is singular, and it demands a word of notice here. He has not the volume or the power of poets who, coming in times more favorable, have attained to the to an independent criticism of life. But he lived with the great poets. He lived above all with the Greeks through perpetually studying and enjoying them, and he caught their poetic points of view for regarding life, caught their poetic manner. The points of view and the manner are not self-sprung in him. He caught them of others, and he had not the free and abundant use of them, but where Addison and Pope never had the use of them, Gray had the use of them at times. He is the scantiest and frailest of the classics in our poetry, but he's a classic. So you know how he's giving a lot of quality and about the Gray, and we are trying to understand Gray in a better way through the words of Arnold. And now after Gray, we are here draw towards the end of 18th century. So that's how he is concluding the 18th century, and he comes to the another writer, that is Burns. So the real Burns of is of course in his Scotch poems. Let us boldly say that of much of his poetry, a poetry dealing perpetually with Scotch drink, Scotch religion, Scotch manner, and Scotchman's estimate is apt to his personal. A Scotchman is used to this world of Scotch drink, Scotch religion, Scotch manner. He has a tenderness of it. He meets its poet halfway. In this tender mood, he reads a piece like Holy Fair or Halloween. But this world of Scotch drink, Scotch religion, Scotch manner is against a poet. Not for him when it is a partial countryman who treat him. So actually, Robert Burns was from Scotland, and that's how we can understand, you know, what is the theme of his poetry. It is a Scotch manner, it is a Scotch life, Scotch religion, and Scottish drink. All these descriptions are there. So Burns' world of Scotch drink, Scotch religion, Scotch manner is often a harsh, sordid, and repulsive world. Even the world of the world of that is the Cotter's Saturday Night is not a beautiful world. So this is how we come to know about the Robert Burns. There is a great deal of that sort of thing in Burns, and it is unsatisfactory. Not because it is poetry, but because it has that accent of sincerity which so with still more confidence of his admirers tell us that we have the genuine Burns, the great poet with his trained assets and independent equality, dignity of man in the famous this song. Now we are coming towards end, and in the last, because these are last 2 pages only, I'm just about to conclude the whole text, and that is he's talking about the verse, you know, how the verse are being formed, how the verse is being written, and these are the simple clear explanation he's trying to give about verse. And he says that you know, the verses always have high seriousness, and the verse has absolute sincerity. So that's how the verse is being written. Okay, but for supreme poetical success, more is required than the powerful application of ideas to life. It must be an application under the conditions fixed by the laws of poetic truth and poetic beauty. Are those laws fixed as an essential condition in the poet's treatment of such matters as are here in question? High seriousness, the high seriousness which comes from absolute sincerity. The accent of high seriousness born of absolute sincerity is what gives to such verse. And Dante's power, I mean, he talks about Dante's power, because Dante was a very a classic, and who has contributed such a great thing in literature. And then he compares in the last paragraph. It's about almost like last 2 pages are there, where in the last he's comparing Burns with the Chaucer, and then he is giving some of the qualities of the Burns. And then he says the freedom of the Chaucer is heightened in the Burns by a reckless energy. The benignity of Chaucer's deepened in Burns into an overwhelming sense of the pathos of things, of the pathos of human nature, the pathos also of non-human nature. Instead of the fluidity of Chaucer's manner, the manner of Burns has sprung, bounding swiftness. Burn is by far the great force, though he has perhaps less charm. The world of Chaucer is fairer, richer, more significant than of Burns. But when the largeness and the freedom of the Burns get full sweep, as in Tom's O Chanter, or still more in that splendid production, The Jolly Beggars, his world may be what it will. His poetic genius triumph over it. In the world of the Jolly Beggars, there is more than hideousness and squalor. And there is bestiality, yet the piece is a superb poetic success. It has breathed truth and power, which make the famous scene in Gothic. So these are the qualities. This is a simple comparison. We can understand this is a comparison between Burn and Chaucer. And what are the other qualities of the Burn? Because then he's comparing Burn with Wordsworth. But we and even if good literature entirely lost currency with world, it would still be abundantly worthwhile to continue to enjoy it by oneself. But it never will lose currency with the world. In spite of momentary appearance, it never will lose supremacy. Currency and supremacy are insured to it, not indeed by the world's deliberate and conscious choice, but by something or far deeper, by the instinct of life preservation in humanity. So here we end, and there are number of references you can find out further. And actually this is what from the reference I'm reading here about the touchstone. The touchstone method, which perhaps is faulty because it probably requires some sense of the context of the touchstone passage, as was Arnold involved as early as his Oxford lectures on translating Homer, 1860-61. An interesting study of the passage for what they reveal Arnold's test in J.S. Ellis. Arnold's conception of 18th century poetry met with vocal opponents from the first. W.J. Courthope, one of the editors of Pope, wrote to demonstrate in contradictions to Arnold that Dryden and Pope are classical of our poetry. The liberal movements in English literature, National Review 3, 633 pages, July 1884, and a letter to the Pall Mall Gazette, July 4, 1884, page 6 more recently. E.K. Brown assembled Arnold's comments on the prose writers and poets of the century to demonstrate that he spoke of the 18th century from the outside with no faculty of for identifying himself with its modes of thinking and feeling, living. Thank you so much. Please subscribe if you like this effort of mine. Please subscribe my channel, like and share, and write me comments that what else you want. If you any topic specifically you want me to cover, I will do that. So write a comment, and thank you so much.